Right, we'll kick off as people are joining. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest progress report briefing on net zero with Lord Deben, Chair of the Committee on Climate Change. Bir Mafalami, our Chair, can't join us this morning, and our Vice Chairs are wrapped up with various select committees. So you've got me. But that means that there's plenty more time for Lord Deben to speak, which is a benefit for everybody. The chat and the Q&A are open. I urge you all to use them, as Lord Deben has shown in the 3 previous briefings that we've done with him. He's happy to answer anything within reason. So please feel free to ask any burning questions that you have. As I mentioned, this is the 4th such briefing. We're always grateful, Lord Deben, for your time and for your insights. It's the first since the Committee on Climate Change that you chair published both the update to Parliament and the latest report on climate impacts in the UK and our preparedness for them. There was some strong advice from ministers in both those reports. My own take on it, I don't know whether you agree with this, but it felt like a slight shift in tone in the strength of the advice that was given. I wonder if you have any reflections on that and reflections on how those reports were received. But one of the things that they really crystallised was this big gap, as it was described, between the commitments and the promises that have been made and where we are on delivery. And in that gap lies policy, detailed policy and funding. One of the things we've been waiting for is the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which has been published today and which Grant Shapps will make a statement on in the Commons this afternoon. So if you have any initial reflections on that, I'm sure people would want to hear them. And I think just finally, one thing these briefings have done is really focused on the domestic side of things. And one of the things that a strong domestic position gives you is a foundation for international leadership, which is particularly important given we've got the presidency of COP26. But I just wonder if I can ask you for your fairly quick reaction to the vote in the House of Commons yesterday on overseas aid, and whether, beyond the very real implications for the poorest countries in the world, that vote will have, whether you feel that it weakens or affects the UK's capacity, either morally or practically, for leadership on climate change. I get that that's a very leading question, but over to you for some opening remarks, and then we'll go from there.
Well, let's get that one out of the way first of all. I think it was a disgrace. I think that when you're in a difficulty, you don't kick people who are in a much more difficult position than you are. I have members of my family who certainly shan't be supporting the members of Parliament who voted in favour of hurting the poorest. I mean, I thought Mrs May's speech was absolutely right. This means fewer women getting education. It means fewer families getting water. It means fewer children being educated. I don't think that's an acceptable position. It's contrary to what the Conservative Party said in its manifesto, and I think it is morally obnoxious. There are many decisions that you can make where you can disagree. I don't think this is one of those. I think this is to behave in a way which is entirely immoral, and I think it will do great harm because we had committed ourselves to this. It was in our election manifesto of the government. And therefore, why should anybody believe anything else we're going to say? So I do think it does a very, very significant damage, even though we have exempted the money that we're going to spend on climate change. And so for me, this was a sad day and not something which is helping the campaign that we have between us. Again, I don't think you need to read me, just read Mrs May's speech, and I think that sums it up. And for the first time in 25 years, she voted against the government on that basis. I thought it was a brave and sensible speech. As far as other things are concerned, well, yes, there is a slight change of tone, not a change of what our responsibilities are, because they are laid down very clearly in the original Climate Change Act. But obviously, when you have got to a stage in which the main outline and the route map for reaching the decision to reduce our emissions to net zero, when you've got that programme in front of you, the next role of a climate change committee is to spend more time on helping the government to do the things you need to do to reach that goal. The first job you have to do is to show what the science says, and then you have to show what that means in reality. And then when that shows that you've got to get to net zero, you then have to show how you get to net zero. And if you remember, the government asked us very clearly, could we do it? When could we do it by, and what would it cost? And that was a very direct question, and the government should have every credit for that. But having said that, when you have finally answered those questions, you produce the route map, but at every point there are questions: should you be doing this? Should we be delivering that? What comes first? Are issues being overlooked? And those are the things which the Climate Change Committee is charged with dealing with under the Climate Change Act. And there's a second area, which is that those who were climate change deniers and then became lukewarmers, I think was the phrase, and have now moved to a new stage, in which is what they try to suggest is that doing what we have to do will be far too expensive and the cure is worse than the disease. And it will be up to the Climate Change Committee to show very clearly that this is not true. First of all, it's not true in the sense that if we don't do these things, then the disease is devastating. I mean, it isn't a sensible concept of swapping the destruction of our whole planet because you're not prepared to take measures. I mean, that in the widest sense is obviously not safe. Secondly, the cost of not doing what we are proposing now is very much greater than doing it, because what it means is that you would allow your economy to rest back in the conditions of pre-COVID, and you wouldn't be escaping from COVID at all. Many of the things that we have to do in order to regain our economic strengths in any case. I mean, the idea that you're going to become a nation-rich global player without doing green things in today's world seems to me to be obviously not so. Nobody's going to buy our exports if they are not exports which fit in with their green demands. We're not going to be able to run a society if we insist upon having petrol and diesel vehicles, which will become increasingly more expensive than the electric vehicles, which are now more expensive, but before 2026 and 2027 will become cheaper. So do you really want to have a society in which you don't take the cheaper, better alternative? Do you want a society where the cheaper, better alternative means cleaner air, but you're not going to do it because you don't think you want to take these steps? It seems to me to be a remarkably stupid position that is taken, and it's taken by people who know perfectly well that this is so, because it's not really that is the argument. The argument is that they have not been prepared to accept the reality of climate change, nor the opportunity that climate change gives us to recast and reconcentrate our economy in a way which can make us the same sort of leader of the new industrial revolution that we were for the old industrial revolution. And having been the major contributors, because we were the first, to the dirtying up of the world, all I think is very obvious is we ought to be the major contributors of cleaning up the world, and we'll make a lot of money on it. Cleaning up is exactly what it should say. Now, we have said that it will cost less than 1% of our gross national product. There are various ways of putting that. I always find those sort of figures are so big that people find them very difficult. So that the best way I have seen done is to say, If it costs us that, I'll explain why I say if it costs us that, then it means that in 2050, we will reach the level of our standards of living, the gross national product, 4 months later than we would have done if we hadn't spent this money. So in the context, the total overall cost is really a perfectly sensible one. But there are two important caveats. The first is that those costs don't take into account the savings which take place. And in my view, we will find that actually those savings will more than outweigh the actual costs. But of course, they don't go to the same people or the same issues, that you have to think about them separately. But as a cost to the economy, it seems to me that we can do what we need to do for the most part without cost. But let's put the conservative figure on 1%. And that is not in any way a frightening difference. But the second problem is that, of course, the cost will not fall fairly. It's not like that. First of all, most of the cost will be paid by private enterprise doing the changes and making the things that they need to do. And the cost for them of doing that would, of course, be put on purchases of things as well as money borrowed. And in those circumstances, and thank goodness we're at a time of very low borrowing costs, is an absolutely ideal moment to make these changes that we need. But all the same, there will be costs which come on families which will be less able to pay them. And that's why we in the Climate Change Committee are really clear about two very simple statements. This is not a huge bill. We can afford to pay it. We can't afford not to pay it. But it will not be properly acceptable unless we make it fair. And that's why we asked the Treasury to produce a document showing how it could be made fair. And we are waiting for that document. No doubt we'll have it before COP26, but it's a very important document. Because up to now, we've not been very interested in that, have we? I mean, if you take the mammoth and really remarkable achievement of George Osborne in making us the leader in generation of offshore wind by allowing 6.8 billion to be spent on it. That's why we're there. We created a market. We've now got one of the cheapest ways of generating electricity that there is. But how did we pay for it? Well, we paid for it on electricity bills. And that, of course, meant that 80% of the population has both gas and electricity. But the 20% that doesn't have electricity has amongst it some of the poorest people. So they don't have gas, rather, they have electricity. Some of the poorest people are already paying more for their heating than those who have gas. Well, this is not an acceptable mechanism. And that's why we've said that the cost, first of all, has to be moved so that it covers both. For the 80%, it won't make much difference because it'll be on both of them instead of just one of them. But for the 20% whom we want to help, there will be a reduction in the cost of their electricity. And there is no reason either to say to ourselves, why on earth are we putting the cost on the thing we want people to use instead of the thing we want people to use less of? So there are those sort of things. And it's about fairness in so many other ways. So if you take the Green Deal, we really do have to recognise that the government's had a great success. Nobody talks about that, but it's a great success. And that is the money that it has spent through the local authorities. And there's been another £500 million put into that because it's such a success. The thing it's failed at is to find a mechanism whereby it can help ordinary people change their heating systems. And that's really leads into my last point, which is what was the the real burden of our two statements. The real burden is very simple. It is that the government has, in general, absolutely the right of determination. It's got policies which we could all agree with. The 10-point plan of the Prime Minister is an extremely good plan. So let's not underestimate the contribution made by government, which has made some very brave decisions in terms of the 68% reduction by 2030 and the further reductions later on to meet the 2035 date. This is a government which has really stepped up to the mark. The problem is what then happens, because you can't just have the targets, you've actually got to deliver against those targets. And so you're quite right, it is the delivery issue which we have taken up, and we have been department by department showing them what it is that they need to do. And so you come back to the example I was using, which is their very good success with the Green Deal through local government, no success at all, so you had to withdraw it, of the one with the general public. And that is a real issue. The government's got to find ways of doing that. But also it's got to find better ways of dealing with local government, because local government's the only organisation that's going to be able to deliver all this. And I've come freshly off yesterday's meeting, which brilliantly chaired by the Mayor of the West Midlands. And Andy Street and his team was absolutely right to say local government wants to be partners, and they have produced a document, which is a document offering the government partnership. But they need to have the other side, the government accepting that partnership. And I do think that it is very difficult to see in the local government department, which didn't take part in that particular discussion, it was Bays and Alok Sharma who were involved, but that the local government department really has no plans, as far as I can see, to build out a relationship with local government, well, first of all, with the national governments, then the regionals and the local government, and even the parish councils, all of which have got a part to play. But there's no central help, there's no helpline to say, well, if you're going to go for net zero in 2030, these are some of the things you want to look at. Leeds has done this rather well. Go and have a look at what Suffolk has done. They've done that rather well. I'm trying to choose different political parties because there's no political division in this. But there is none of that. And so every local authority has to invent the wheel for itself again. And nor is there a feeling in local government that the government sees it as partners. Sees it as a convenient people to be asked to do something, but not as partners. And yet there's a huge amount of knowledge and understanding in local government, and local government is much closer to its people than central government. And much of what we have to do is about individuals and individual streets. And that means that local government ought to be very much involved in this. And it's a point that we've made very clear in our report.
Thank you, Lord Deben. I've got a few questions actually to follow up, but I'm glad that you raised the summit yesterday with local leaders. I was a little bit involved in some of the work behind that, and I think the statement that you were talking about, I'll post the link to it so everybody can have a look at it before we finish this session. The communique, I think it was referred to as. It was, like you say, I think it was quite a strong statement. It was a 6-point plan for partnership between local and national government. But that absence of a clear picture for local government about how it can be involved in partnership with the delivery of net zero in a way that works for both local and national government. How does that get solved? You know, thinking about commitments that government has made, the devolution white paper that was promised in the manifesto in 2019, I'm not sure we've seen anything of that. I mean, I think, as I understand it, it's been written and it's effectively been shelved for now. I don't know if that's been overtaken by the levelling up agenda and the centralisation of that agenda into the Cabinet Office. Do you think it takes something like a big new piece of legislation on devolution to solve that problem? Or can you do it in a slightly more policy orientated way and maybe some smaller technical changes?
Well, I think you have to start off with ensuring that people around the country think that MHCLG wants to have a cooperative system. Much of this is a way of talking, a way of dealing with people. Now, there's also a need for resources. And one of the problems is, and this is not a political issue, party political issue, every party finds that when it gets into power, whatever it's said about devolution, it finds that the central civil servants are much more likely to say, oh, well, we better keep that power, Minister. You shouldn't let them do all those things. You see, they don't all have the competence to do. Well, of course, it's perfectly true. There are dreadful local authorities. I could list them. They're really terrible and they're unconnected with party politics. I mean, if I'm not going to say it now, but if I were to put the two worst local authorities in London, one would be Conservative and the other would be Labour. So you don't have to, this is not a party political thing. It's about how competent people are. So if you want to get this to work, what you need to do is to give more power, show that you want to work with, so that it's not just a question, I'll give you the power and you get on with it, which is what the government does when it doesn't want to get punished for something that it's done by cutting some grant or other. It puts the system to be done by the local authority. But that it's still part of it, it's a partnership. And the other thing it's got to recognise is that it's got to help people with the money. And that's exactly what's happened over the Green Homes grant, because the money that has been used by local authorities has been enormously successful because they knew where to spend it, they knew how to spend it, and they have done it in the most cost-effective way that's possible for government to do, which is not always very cost-effective, but it's the best they can do. So I'm very clear that it's that leadership that we want.
Thank you. That's just sticking on local government and actually on the Green Homes Grant, local authority delivery scheme, but for the benefit of the people who joined the call, there's a good blog actually from Dan Meredith, who's part of the PRASEG circle, on the way that the local authority scheme was administered and how it was successful. That's on our website, so people can take a look at it. It's quite interesting. There's a question from Anne Stewart, just while we're sticking with local government. Another problem for local government is that much of their planning decisions are affected by the National Planning Policy Framework. This is something you actually, Lord Deben, have talked about in these briefings before. And that this not only fails to support decisions that mitigate climate change, but sometimes actually conflicts with them. Is the CCC urging a revision of the NPPF? Yes,
we are. We've made it very clear that we need a new Planning Act. And my comparison is very simple. The Chancellor has rightly said to the Bank of England that reaching net zero must be a central part of its planning programme, that it's one of the things that it has to make sure that we do. There's nothing like this in the planning system. The planning system is absolutely crucial to do this. Everything from land use right the way through to the houses we build and where we build them. All these things are affected by climate change. So we did have a Planning Act which says that in all planning decisions, the issues of climate change and net zero have to be part of the decision process. And unless we do that, of course, we're not going to reach the end we want. And there's a very good example, I think. The Cumbrian County Council came in for a bit of stick because it originally gave a permit for a coal mine. Actually, it had no ability to think otherwise, because there's nothing in the planning arrangements to say that it shouldn't. And there is, I've tried very hard to find it, but I cannot find any indication that they were given any advice by MHCLG. Well, now, as we all know, everyone recognised having a new coal mine would not be a sensible way to say that you were proceeding to net zero. Then the arguments in favour of the new coal mine began to fall apart when it turned out that only 20% of the coal was going to be used here. If you remember, the argument was if we did it here, we wouldn't have to import it in the United States. Truth was that only 20% was going to be used here and the rest was going to be exported. And nobody had managed to tell the people who wanted to do that we're not going to use coal after about 2035, even in the circumstances of the specialist circumstances of steel. So the fact of the matter is, the planning system has got to include those things. And unfortunately, the proposals that we've heard so far go in the opposite direction. And therefore, we are looking very closely at the question of planning, and we've made it very clear that that has to be very different. Not least, after all, because one of the biggest things we've got to do for climate change is to do different things about land use. And you can't think about land use just in terms of agriculture, in terms of forestry. You've got to think about it also in terms of concretization, of using land for building. And you've got to think about sustainable urban drainage. You've got to think about availability of water. You've got to think about the likelihood of flooding. And you've got to think about what happens if we go on, as we will, having more and more hot periods. All these things should be in the Planning Act, and they're not, and they've got to be. And therefore, this is one of the biggest jobs of the government. And I would have hoped that they would learn the lesson of the by-election, in which quite clearly the thing that most riled the population and meant that they lost the seat was that the people felt that they were being excluded from the way in which their area was being planned. Interestingly, it wasn't HS2 as much as that aspect of planning. And I always think it's worthwhile when the Liberal Democrats win the seat, they are usually very good at explaining what it was that enabled them to turn the seat. And their key issue was the planning thing. Well, this government should learn. That's a real problem. We've got to get that right.
Thanks a lot, Deben. Just having a scan of the audience, as well as listening to your answer on that question, I've noticed we've got a couple of peers, including Lord Oates, who's a new Vice Chair of PRASEG and a Liberal Democrat. So I'm going to be cheeky and promote Lord Oates to a panellist if he would like to make a remark about that. If he wouldn't like to do that, then he can relegate himself to a member of the audience as well. But just before we get to that, you mentioned about going department by department in your analysis and your advice as a committee, and ultimately a lot of this comes down to money. So I wonder if you've got a perspective on where the Treasury really is. I know you're requiring some work from the Treasury, or you've requested some work from the Treasury. I understand that the net zero review is a subject of a bit of a row between Treasury and Number 10 at the moment, partly because, as I understand it, the Treasury is focused far more on costs than benefits, and isn't really doing the dynamic modelling that can show what the economic benefits will be. So just the sense of where you think the Treasury as a department is, but also where you think the Chancellor is on net zero. But I think we'll park that question. Lord Oates hasn't removed himself from the panel. So if Lord Oates, you've got any comments to make on the by-election and on the agenda more generally, it'd be great to hear them.
Thanks very much. I can't, apparently I'm not allowed to switch on my video, which is why you're just seeing a still picture of me. But anyway, no, I mean, I think Lord Deben is correct in his analysis that the people of Chesham and Amersham, where it's fair to be said, I spent quite a lot of time, were not very happy with the government's position on planning. I think that's perfectly true. I think they weren't happy with quite a number of things, but that, if there was one single issue, I think that is probably the biggest thing. And I think actually, if you want sustainable development to take place, you really need to ensure and properly engage with local communities. There's not a way of doing it otherwise, and I think the government will find it has it end up being counterproductive on those sort of issues. But as so often, Lord Deben is absolutely correct on these things.
I do try to be independent, but don't be too pleasant, because otherwise I will be in trouble. But the reality is that it is in government always more difficult to deliver. Governments don't deliver easily, and it doesn't matter what the subject is. It's just true that governments are much better at saying things and setting out policies than actually delivering them. I always remember Tony Blair said at the beginning of his second period of office, he said, we'll have learnt in the first one that we were wrong. He said, we thought that if you said something, it would happen, and it doesn't. You've actually got to make it happen. And I think that is one of the problems of government. They tend to think of it like that, and we've just got to help them. And I mean help because they're trying to do the right thing, and we have to help them, and we have to help them in two ways. One is finding ways which it is easier to do, and we've got to help them to understand that there's a real need for public information, public consideration, the sort of thing that we learned in that very remarkable public discussion which we had, which was a great success. And we've got to go on doing that. And I think the third thing we've got to help them with is we've got to help them in fighting the battle for recognizing that this is doable, and that it's doable at a cost which is not by any means impossible, because clearly they will be and are under pressure from those who don't want to do it. And they cease to claim that climate change isn't happening, because that's impossible now, because they see it too obviously. But they now use all sorts of arguments that this is all too expensive and can't be done. And that is what we have to help the government to overcome.
If I may just comment, and then I will shut up, I promise. But just on one other aspect, what Lord Deben said, which is related to local authorities. And I promise I will start being rude about Lord Deben, so it doesn't sound like his impartiality is in any way affected. But on this point, I think this delivery thing is absolutely critical. And as he says, it's not a partisan issue. It is absolutely just about how you deliver on the ground. And even the best government in the world, most effective government in the world, cannot do it from Whitehall. And what we're going to have to do, I think, to affect so much of this, whether it's the sort of Green Homes grant stuff, whether it's trying to get heat pumps installed or whatever, is to use that convening power of local authorities and their knowledge on the ground to actually deliver. Because I think, you know, as he says, there's good and bad councils of all sorts, but they do have that ability on the ground, and I do think we've got to get much better at utilising it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's just fact of life. It's and when people complain, well, some of them aren't very good. Well, I'm afraid the only answer to that is try to help to make them better. And they won't get any better if they don't have the powers to do the jobs properly, because then you can't really criticise them, can you? So you've really got to get this right. So much of what we have to do is, as I say, a person by person, street by street, and also to help people understand these things. I mean, I think I've said on an earlier occasion, I've got an electric car and I've got a heat pump. Buying the electric car, if you have the money, is the easiest thing in the world, because they want to sell you one, and you can look at a lot of them and you choose the one, and then you pay the money and you get the car. You try trying to buy a heat pump. The thing is the most complicated thing in the world. And yet, when you think about it, there are God knows how many million semi-detached houses of roughly the same size all over the country. It must be possible to have a package which enables you to do that with a heat pump at a reasonable price, on a basis which local authorities could oversee to make sure the people who do it properly. And that seems to be a very simple issue. The other thing is local government is very often better at explaining things to the people of its town, because it knows them and it knows how you say these things. And it's so much of what we're talking about is absolute gobbledygook to people outside, which is why I've banned the use of the word kilowatt hour in the Climate Change Committee, because I don't know what a kilowatt hour is. I can't feel it, I can't smell it, I can't touch it, I can't taste it. But I do know what my bill is. I do know how much I pay. And therefore, if something says to me that is less or more, it means something. Telling me that kilowatt hour cost of electricity has gone up by 3% is a meaningless phrase for the majority of people. We can't hear you.
You'd think I would have learned by now about the mute button. There's a couple of questions related to these points that I want to quickly run through. One's from Deanne Somerville, and it's about that local engagement and who you feel should lead it. I was hearing from your answer there that local government, on balance, for you would be the best, I guess, like the best conduit through which that conversation with ordinary citizens could take place. Although Deanne's point is that energy professionals feel that there needs to be that community level conversation, and perhaps it could be local businesses or citizens engaged in those communities that could be part of it too, and how that works in practice. So there's a specific question there about how the engagement works, but there's also another question which has come up in the Q&A, and it's been upvoted actually, about whether you are frustrated with what appears to be another delay in the publication of the heat and building strategy, which is the thing that will tie all of this stuff about decarbonisation of homes and heat together. It was slated to be published this week. Again, it appears to have been delayed again. And alongside that, whether you feel that the idea of compensating households for increased gas costs is a sensible approach to incentivising the switch to lower carbon heating alternatives. I think this is something that was floated in the Times last week. So thoughts on engagement, thoughts on the heat and building strategy, and then I think we're going to shift on to that question about the Treasury and then forward from there.
Well, engagement, yes, local authorities have to play a major part, if not the major part, but there are lots of other people. And all that I feel is that as long as we guard local authorities from the danger which they all have, which is of becoming municipalizers in the sense that they don't want to reach out beyond the local authority. That's always a danger, whether they are Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat, there's a tendency. And I've seen it in so many places. So you need to make it quite clear that they should be using all the possibilities at their hands. I mean, I've just been looking at the something that one wouldn't even sort of thought about, but the Bishop of Middlesbrough, a Catholic diocese, has set up a very remarkable operation in which he is using his sources to help people make these kinds of decisions and to do them properly through the churches. Well, my goodness, you know, there are a lot of people out there who can be part of this if they are enthused, and both the Church of England and the Catholic Church have taken on some pretty tough desires, but they will work better if local authorities are also working with them, but they will reach to different people, and all that can be done. Business people, all sorts of organizations are perfectly capable of doing this, but they do need in the place the local authority which is of that place to bring those things together, and I think it's really very important. Of course, I don't like saying I'm frustrated, but I had hoped that was going to come forward, and the slower it is, the more difficult it will be to do these things, because every month that goes by, climate change gets worse and the cost of putting it right gets greater, that's all. So we need to have this. There's a degree of urgency which is absolutely essential, and that's why I am disappointed and expect this to come, and then I hope that it's going to be better than it would have been because of the delay. I shall be happier if it's an improvement rather than a watering down. And if I may just say one thing about this, which has really been most peculiar. One or two commentators have said, that, well, what is the climate, the Climate Change Committee seems to be doing things which it shouldn't be doing. I mean, these are all matters for Parliament. Well, actually, these are the decisions of Parliament. What we're doing is what Parliament has told us to do under the Climate Change Act and under each of the budgets. We set the budgets, but it's Parliament that agrees them. And it's Parliament that votes on them, and it's Parliament that has accepted that they are now statutorily necessary. The Climate Change Committee does nothing that is not directly determined by the Act and by Parliament. And sometimes a ministry will ask us to do something because they feel that they need this information. We will do that. But we certainly don't do things which we do not have the parliamentary requirement to do. And I think there's a bit of an effort by some people to try to suggest, well, this is all not really very good because it's the Climate Change Committee and it really, it shouldn't have this power. Well, that's what Parliament's given it. And the great advantage of the Parliament giving it to us is that we don't compete with Parliament because we're not in any way representative. We don't claim to be. We're scientists and economists and me. And you can say what I am, but I am the chairman, and I was chosen by a Liberal Democrat minister in the United Kingdom government, and a Scots nationalist, a Welsh socialist, and a Protestant unionist from the north of Ireland. So I don't think I can be claimed as being anything but representative in that round, in that sense. So what we're saying to the government is, this is the truth. This is the science. This is the best way that we can see that you can achieve the goal you have set up, which is net zero by 2050. And we will remind you of what isn't happening, because that's what the Act says. And having reminded you of what's happening, we will measure whether you do it or not, which is what the Act says. And that's why it's such a good Act, because it means the government has got the great advantage of having an entirely impartial set of people that helps to keep it on the straight and narrow. And I must say, as a minister for 16 years, being kept on the straight and narrow by some of these things was a very important thing, because it's so easy to say, this isn't the moment, I've got this other problem, put it off. That's what Climate Change Committee stops.
Very clear, thank you. I did say to Lord Deben in the practice session before the call started that we try and finish for 11:45, because everybody is a bit zoomed out as we approach parliamentary recess, but there's still quite a lot to get into. So I'm going to ask you for another 10 minutes, and we are going to finish a little bit early just to give everybody a bit of chance before their 12 o'clock meetings to make a cup of tea or whatever it is that you need to do. Just on the Treasury, very quickly, where do you think the Treasury is on this? Where do you think the Chancellor is? That's a question that I get asked an awful lot, and I don't have a particularly clear answer on it. I think it's hard to judge. You hear him saying some things that are relatively warm about action on climate change, and then you see a lot of resistance from the Treasury as well. Be interested in a perspective on that. And then there's a few questions in the chat on energy that we'll come to. If we've time, I might ask a slightly political question as well, but just quickly on the Treasury if you can.
Well, I think the Treasury is on side, and I think that it has accepted the basic realities that we're talking about, and that it realises that the only way forward is the green way forward. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it does have a role, which is to ensure that we do things in the most cost-effective way. So it's bound to draw attention to the costs, the rest of it. If I had any criticism at all, it is that I do think that you've got to put these costs together with the advantages, with the gains, all the time. And one of the problems is that if you're not careful, you become very negative, because you just talk about the costs and you don't mention the two other things which any businessman would do. They'd say, this is what the cost is, This is what the cost of not doing this is, and this is the advantage we get from doing it. Those are the three things you need to know. And the Treasury needs always to do it in that manner. Of course, we're entering the period of arguing with ministers how much money they may have. And when the Treasury is in that mood, its whole job is to explain why you can't have any money and you can't have it and you couldn't do it that way anyway, and all that. So there's a psychology which changes slightly there. As far as Rishi Sunak is concerned, he is quite clearly personally involved and committed. The problem is that he doesn't always see things of the world as a whole through the same eyes as I might. Well, then we're different people, and he obviously didn't see the seriousness of the cut in overseas aid in the way that I do. But we can't all be the same. But in many other areas, he has been extremely good, and particularly in that groundbreaking decision to tell the Bank of England that its future decisions have all got to be within the context of net zero. That was a major change and not something which has been done in many other countries. So I remain very enthusiastic about what he wants to do. I shall probably find myself in disagreement about some of the things that go on the way.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing about that in the relevant PRASEG Net Zero Progress Report briefing. Just a quick one. Joe Burlington's asked a couple of questions, or kind of one question, but with a few different parts. The context for which is the extreme heat that we're seeing in Canada and the USA that I think are focusing everybody's minds in terms of the reports that we see, and I'm sure people who are living through and experiencing them. Ultimately, it's all very well how we generate energy, but we need to use less of it. We need to cut CO2 emissions quickly. It seems like a radical idea, but if you equate climate change and its impacts to a war-like situation and its magnitude, things like petrol, things like food were rationed during those times. Do you think there is a place that we could get to where the use of energy would need to be capped or rationed per person or per business or whatever it might be? Or do you think that's the wrong way to go about it?
Well, you see, I think we have to have a systemic change. In a wartime, you don't do that. What you do is to see what you've got and use it as well as you can. That's not where, and at the end of it, you go back to what you were doing before. That's not where we are at all. We are in the business of systemic change. So what I want to see is the changes made in the system which will deliver. Now, there'll be things which will very often be inconvenient, and they won't necessarily be things that people want. But it's much better to concentrate on getting those things right. I mean, for example, one of the things that we absolutely need is immediate investment in the way in which we distribute electricity. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet the demands of an electric society. And the plans for that aren't really very clear. Secondly, we're going to have to change very fundamentally how we use our land, because we've got to get the earth once again sequestrating carbon. We've got to move to regenerative farming. We've got to recognize that it is better to eat less meat but better meat. All those things are pretty complicated, and it's very easy to make a good deal of fuss over them. I'd much prefer us to spend our time getting the system into the right mechanisms than more or less taking the system and then rationing. I don't think that's a good way forward at all.
Thank you. Joe, there's your answer. I think there's plenty of questions that are still coming through on the chat. I think some of them we may need to follow up in writing. So if we don't get to all of them, then I do apologise. Just a question on the politics around this. You said in your opening remarks, you were talking about there is a school of thought that you know, for some people that the cure is worse than the disease, and that you obviously repudiate that opinion. But I mean, if that was just about evidence, then everybody would agree. Like, there's a political position, and it's, you know, there is some resistance, I think, to net zero and to some of the advice of the committee, and we're seeing that, I guess, organise itself slightly. So I'm thinking of an op-ed that Steve Baker wrote in The Sun a few weeks ago, which was, I think, very sceptical about some of the changes to domestic heating systems that will be required, that we've talked about a bit on this call and on previous calls. Now, he's an individual member of Parliament, but he's also representative of a school of thought. You've mentioned about where you think the Chancellor is. You are a member of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, but you're also a kind of very independent-minded person with an independent position. Where do you think your parliamentary party is in terms of its overall support for the Prime Minister's agenda, and whether you think that, whether you're confident the PM can, I guess, make and win the argument for net zero and the kind of investment and the kind of systemic change that's needed if there is political resistance within or on his own backbenches, or whether you think that analysis is wrong?
Well, first of all, to take my own position, I sit as a Conservative in the House of Lords because I've always been a Conservative, and I've been a Conservative since I first joined when I was 17. So, and I've been a minister for 16 years. It always seemed to me to be pretty peculiar saying suddenly that I wasn't a Conservative. But that doesn't mean to say that I vote as a Conservative. I vote as the person who's represented as the chairman of the Climate Change Committee, and that means that I don't always find myself on the same side as the government. But that would be true whether there were a Labour government or a Liberal Democrat government or a mixture, because that is the truth of being, in that sense, a single issue person. Now, as far as the sort of op-ed you're talking about, the problem with them is that they don't actually deal with the facts. We haven't been through all this without knowing what the facts are. And the facts are very clear. We know that it will be expensive to move from the gas system we have today to the necessary system which does not destroy the world. And that's what we have to do. We have said that people have got to be helped to make that change. And they should be helped in two ways. First of all, the government has so far done exactly the wrong thing. It has allowed 1 million homes to be built by builders who have passed on the cost of making their homes fit for the future to the people who bought those homes, when they should have put it into the construction at a very much lower cost. That's 1 million homes that have to be retrofitted. Now, I have a real belief that they particularly should deserve some kind of compensation. What on earth were those builders doing it? They knew perfectly well. What was the government doing, the Conservative government doing in 2017 in getting rid of the Zero Homes agreement, which the Labour Party had put in before? And so there's a good deal of both government and house builders owe us something on this front, because they should never have been in this position, primarily the government, but there we are. So we've got to have a system in which we help people to make those changes. And it may be that you can help them by enabling them to do them and spread the costs very considerably. You may be able to do it by making it less expensive to use electricity by shifting the costs onto gas. All sorts of things you can do. And I don't think it's for the Climate Change Committee to decide which of those it is. It's for the government. And the government knows that it's got to do that. And I suspect that one of the worries is that the closer it gets to the moment, it's actually got to decide which of those things it's going to have to do. And that is never politically attractive. Can the Prime Minister deliver? Yeah, he can deliver because every day it becomes more clear that climate change is happening. You were talking about the heat in Canada. You're talking about the floods elsewhere. You're talking about what is happening in our own backyard. We are recognizing that climate change is happening and it's very serious. I just use a single example, which is not a frightening one. It just is a devastating one, which is that in 1960, the spring came 17 days later than it does now. And that means that the blossoms come out at a different time from the pollinators, and that we are actually messing up the way in which our whole lives depend. And all those gardeners out there, the 3 million additional gardeners through coronavirus, might well think about that. And if they don't now, they will more and more, as they can't use water because there are terrible droughts. But in the winter, they find the garden is flooded because there's this water that comes down in the magnitude that we've seen. You may have seen that the whole of July's water fell in an hour in Kew Gardens only yesterday. We are living through a period in which increasingly people will say to government, you've got to do something about it. And so the world is with Boris Johnson, and I think he has every chance to stand up. And as any Prime Minister, I'm not making a comment about him, but any Prime Minister has the opportunity to stand up and lead, and therefore he can do it.
Thank you, Lord Deben. Some stark, but also a kind of note of optimism at the end. Some stark advice for us throughout this call, though. We talk about political leaders keeping their promises. I promised you all some time back, and I failed to deliver that. So I apologise. It's 12 o'clock, so I think we're going to need to call it there. But Lord Deben, on behalf of everybody who is involved with PRASEG, thank you again for your time and for your insight. I know everybody really appreciates it and enjoys these sessions. We'll be doing plenty more of them in the future. I was slightly concerned at one point because I think we've reflected often that every conversation we've had has always mentioned the Catholic Church and Brexit. And we did get to the Catholic Church through the Diocese of Middlesbrough in the end. So that was a positive. Everybody whose questions we've not quite got to, I will follow up with directly in writing. Lord Oates, thank you for letting me put you on the spot and for contributing to the conversation as well. We'll be back in touch with details for the next session. And Lord Deben, all the best to you in the meantime, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you.